George Michael was standing in aisle 7 of Patterson's grocery, holding a box of cornflakes, when a young man pointed a gun at his chest. The woman next to George was shaking with fear, but George himself felt nothing. His heart rate was normal. He had been in worse situations before, in countries where people died every day, so this didn't scare him at all. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far our stories reach and how they resonate across the globe. After everything was over, George found out that the whole robbery had been fake. The police who showed up weren't real police officers. They were actors. The woman in the red dress, whose name was Joanne Daniel, told George that she owned the grocery store and had staged the entire robbery to test him. She said she ran a company called Thornton Security that helped corporations deal with dangerous situations, and she wanted George to work for her because he had stayed calm during the fake robbery. Joanne explained that the young man with the gun was named Silas Reed, and he was an actor she had hired. She told George that she had been watching everything on cameras hidden in the store. She said most people panic when guns were pointed at them, but George hadn't panicked at all. That impressed her. She gave George a folder that contained copies of his military records. She knew he had spent 12 years in special operations doing interrogation work. She knew his wife had died 4 years ago. She knew he had an 8-year-old daughter named Emily. She knew he had been working small security jobs that didn't pay well. Joanne offered George a job as the head of a new division at Thornton Security. She said she would pay him $200,000 per year, which was more money than George had made in the last 3 years combined. She said he would train corporate executives how to handle crises. George needed the money badly because he had bills to pay and a daughter to support, so he told Joanne he would think about it. She gave him her business card and left. After Joanne drove away, George sat down next to Silas on a bench inside the store. George told Silas that he knew the whole thing had been a setup from the beginning. Silas wasn't surprised. He asked George if he was going to take the job, and George said yes because he needed the money. George started working at Thornton Security on a Monday morning. The office was in a tall glass building downtown. When he arrived, a receptionist gave him a temporary ID badge and told him Joanne was waiting for him in a conference room. Joanne was sitting at a table with her laptop. She welcomed George and told him he needed to sign some papers before he could officially start working. She said the papers were non-disclosure agreements that would prevent him from talking about Thornton's business with anyone outside the company. While George waited for the papers to arrive, Joanne explained how Thornton Security worked. She said the company operated in 3 areas: prevention, response, and recovery. Prevention meant training people before crises happened. Response meant helping people during actual emergencies. Recovery meant helping organizations rebuild after disasters. She said George's job would focus mostly on prevention and response. He would create training programs and run simulations for clients. Joanne told George that Thornton's clients included major corporations, government contractors, and diplomatic missions. She said the company was very selective about which contract it accepted because reputation was important. An assistant brought in the papers, and George signed them without reading them carefully. He had already decided to take the job, so the details didn't matter to him. After George signed the papers, Joanne told him about his first assignment. She said he would be leading a simulation the next day for executives from a pharmaceutical company that was opening a new facility in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The area was dangerous, with high crime rates and political problems. The executives needed to learn how to handle situations like hostage negotiations and armed intrusions. Joanne asked George if he could handle the assignment, and George said he could. What Joanne didn't know was that George had recognized Silas immediately during the fake robbery. George had met Silas 5 years earlier in Afghanistan. Back then, Silas had been working as a translator for a private contractor. He had also been serving as an informant for George's military unit. Silas had provided information about a weapons smuggling network, and when the smugglers discovered there was an informant in their organization, George had rescued Silas from a warehouse where he was being held. George had arranged for Silas to be sent back to the United States and had made sure he received medical treatment for a bullet wound. George hadn't thought about Silas in years, so seeing him in the grocery store had been a shock. But George hadn't said anything during the robbery because he immediately understood that something strange was happening. Silas shouldn't have been working as an actor. The last time George had checked, Silas had been working security for a tech company in Seattle. So George had decided to play along with Joanne's test and figure out what was really going on. That night, George called Silas from his apartment. Silas answered after 4 rings and told George they needed to meet in person. He said Joanne had surveillance everywhere and they couldn't talk on the phone. He told George to meet him at a coffee shop near Thornton Security at 7 o'clock the next morning. George agreed and hung up. He spent the rest of the night thinking about Afghanistan and wondering what Silas was doing working for Joe and Daniel. By morning, George had decided he needed to find out what Thornton Security was really doing, and he was willing to do whatever it took to uncover the truth. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. George met Silas at the coffee shop the next morning. The place was crowded with people buying coffee before work. Silas was sitting in the back corner facing the door, and George sat across from him. Silas pushed a folder across the table and told George to open it, but not to make a scene. Inside the folder were printed emails, financial records, and photographs. The emails showed correspondence between Joe and Daniel and various corporations. But these weren't normal businesses. They were oil companies operating in disputed territories and mining corporations with bad reputations. The financial records showed that millions of dollars were flowing into Thornton Security from companies registered in the Cayman Islands. These payments didn't match the training contracts Joanne had described. The photographs showed Joanne meeting with arms dealers and other criminals. Silas explained that he had gotten all of this information from Joanne's personal computer server. He said he had been working at Thornton long enough to learn her passwords. He told George that Thornton Security wasn't really a crisis management company. Instead, it was a company that created crises on purpose. Joanne would send people to make situations worse, and then she would offer her services to fix the problem she had created. She had been doing this for at least 5 years. George asked Silas why he hadn't gone to the police or the FBI. Silas said he had tried 2 months earlier, but nothing had happened. He said Joanne had connections with people in law enforcement and government who made investigations disappear. That was when Silas realized he needed help from someone who could work outside the normal system. When he saw George's name on Joanne's list of potential recruits, he had volunteered to play the gunman in the fake robbery because he knew George would recognize him and figure out something was wrong. Silas told George that Joanne was planning something big in Brazil. The pharmaceutical simulation George was supposed to run wasn't really a training exercise. It was reconnaissance. Joanne wanted George to identify security vulnerabilities so her people could exploit them later. Silas said they needed to build a case against Joanne that was so strong that even her powerful friends couldn't make it go away. George agreed to help. He told Silas they would need to be careful and couldn't take any more risks accessing Joanne's servers. George said he would play the role of a loyal employee and gain Joanne's trust. While he did that, he would document everything, every meeting, every client, every dollar that moved through Thornton Security. When they had enough evidence, they wouldn't go to the FBI. Instead, they would go to the press and make everything public. Silas agreed with the plan. George told him he would run the Sao Paulo simulation exactly as Joanne expected, identify the vulnerabilities, and write a report. Then he would make a copy of everything and send it to Silas. They would use Joanne's own operation against her. George left the coffee shop and went back to Thornton Security. He spent the rest of the day preparing for the simulation. He studied maps of Sao Paulo and memorized the names of the executives he would be training. While he worked, he thought about Joanne and how she had smiled when offering the job, as if she were doing something noble. By the time George left the office that evening, he had a complete plan. It was dangerous and would require patience, but it was the only way to stop Joanne. The Sao Paulo simulation took 2 days. George worked in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, running pharmaceutical executives through scenarios involving kidnapping, armed robbery, and forced evacuation. He identified 17 security vulnerabilities in the facility they were planning to open. He wrote a detailed report about everything he had found and sent a copy to Silas. Joanne was very happy with George's work. She sent an email to the entire company praising him. She gave him access to more clients and more projects. With each new assignment, George collected more evidence against her. He found contracts with shell companies in Panama. He found emails discussing payments for operational support in conflict zones. He found records showing that Thornton had been involved in situations where people had died. George spent 3 months building the case. He made copies of everything and sent it all to Silas, who organized it into a comprehensive file. They documented Joanne's meetings with criminals. They tracked money flowing through offshore accounts. They collected testimony from former Thornton employees who had quit because they suspected something was wrong. During this time, George had to pretend he was loyal to Joanne. He had to smile at her during meetings. He had to accept her praise when she complimented his work. He had to act like he believed Thornton Security was a legitimate company helping people. It was the hardest role George had ever played. But he kept thinking about his daughter Emily and about all the people who had been hurt by Joanne's schemes. That kept him going. Finally, after 3 months, George and Silas had enough evidence. They had built a case that included financial fraud, conspiracy, and involvement in illegal arms deals. They had proof that Joanne had orchestrated crises in 4 different countries, resulting in at least 12 deaths. They had recordings of Joanne discussing payments to corrupt officials. They had everything they needed. George scheduled a meeting with Joanne in her office. He told her he wanted to discuss expanding his division. When he arrived, Joanne was sitting behind her desk looking pleased with herself. She told George that Thornton Security had just signed its biggest contract ever, worth $50 million. She said George had been instrumental in making it happen. George sat down across from her. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a USB drive. He placed it on her desk. "What's this?" Joanne asked. "Evidence," George said. 3 months of documentation showing that Thornton Security is a criminal enterprise. Financial records, emails, photographs, testimony from witnesses. Everything needed to prove that you've been orchestrating crises and profiting from them. Joanne's expression didn't change. She picked up the USB drive and looked at it. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Michael." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact. And in about 30 minutes, copies of everything on that drive are going to be delivered to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and 3 major television networks. I've also sent copies to the FBI, the Department of Justice, and Interpol. By tonight, everyone will know what you've been doing." Joanne set the USB drive down. For the first time since George had met her, she looked genuinely surprised. "You've been working against me this entire time." "That's right. From the moment I walked into that fake grocery store robbery, I knew something was wrong. I recognized Silas immediately. He was an informant I worked with in Afghanistan. When I saw him playing the role of a desperate gunman, I knew you had made a mistake. So Silas and I decided to use your own recruitment test against you. You wanted to find someone who could infiltrate dangerous organizations. Congratulations. You found him. You just didn't realize a dangerous organization was yours." Joanne stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. "What do you want? Money? I can pay you more than any whistleblower reward would give you. I don't want your money. I want you to face consequences for what you've done. I want the families of the people who died because of your schemes to know the truth. And I want my daughter to grow up in a world where people like you don't get away with profiting from other people's suffering." Joanne turned back to face him. "You've destroyed everything I built." "No, you destroyed it yourself. I just made sure everyone found out." There was a knock on the door. 2 FBI agents entered the office. They had badges and weapons. One of them told Joanne she was under arrest. They read her rights and put handcuffs on her wrists. As they led her out of the office, she looked back at George one last time. "I chose you because I thought you were like me," she said. "I thought you understood that the world is just a game and the only thing that matters is winning." You were wrong. George said, the world isn't a game, and there are some things more important than winning. The agents took Joanne away. George sat in her office for a few more minutes, looking at the city through the window. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Silas. It's done. All the files have been delivered. The news outlets are already running with the story. George typed back, Good. Meet me at the coffee shop. We should talk about what comes next. He left Thornton Security and walked out into the afternoon sunlight. He knew there would be investigations and trials and media attention. He knew the FBI would want him to testify. He knew his life was about to get complicated, but he also knew he had done the right thing. When George got home that evening, Emily was waiting for him. She asked him how his day at work had been. George told her it had been a good day. He said he had solved a big problem and helped some people. Emily said she was proud of him. That night, after Emily went to bed, George sat in his apartment and thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the grocery store and the fake robbery. He thought about Silas and their years working together in Afghanistan. He thought about Joanne and the empire she had built on other people's suffering. And he thought about the future. The FBI had already contacted him about the whistleblower reward. It would be several $1,000,000, enough to secure Emily's future and let George finally stop worrying about money. But more importantly, George had stopped a criminal operation that had been hurting people for years. He had used the skills he learned in the military to do something meaningful again. George picked up his phone and called Silas. When Silas answered, George said, "Thank you for trusting me." "Thank you for coming back for me," Silas replied. Again, they talked for a while about what would happen next. Silas said he was going to testify at Joanne's trial. George said he would do the same. They both knew it wouldn't be easy. Joanne had powerful friends who would try to discredit them, but they also knew they had the truth on their side, and that would be enough. After George hung up, he went to check on Emily one last time. She was sleeping peacefully. George stood in her doorway and watched her for a moment. He thought about all the choices he had made that had led him to this point. The decision to join the military, the decision to become an interrogator, the decision to save Silas in that warehouse in Afghanistan, the decision to take Joanne's job offer even though he knew it was wrong. Every choice had been difficult. Every choice had come with risks. But George had learned a long time ago that the hardest choices were usually the right ones. And as he stood there watching his daughter sleep, he knew he had made the right choice again. The next morning, George woke up to news alerts on his phone. The story about Thornton Security was everywhere. Major news outlets were running headlines about corporate fraud and orchestrated crises. Joanne Daniels' photograph was on the front page of every newspaper. The FBI had announced they were opening a full investigation. Several of Thornton's clients were already distancing themselves from the company. George got Emily ready for school and drove her to class. On the way back home, he stopped at the coffee shop where he had met Silas. Silas was already there, drinking coffee and reading the news on his tablet. "We did it," Silas said when George sat down. "Yeah," George replied. "We did." They sat together in comfortable silence. Two men who had been through hell and back, who had seen the worst of humanity and decided to fight against it anyway. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't make plans or discuss strategy. They just sat together and drank their coffee and enjoyed the fact that, for once, justice had actually been served. Outside the coffee shop, the city continued its normal rhythm. People went to work. Cars moved through traffic. The sun shone down on everything with indifferent warmth. And somewhere in the Federal Detention Center, Joanne Daniel was beginning to understand that her empire had fallen and there was no way to rebuild it. George finished his coffee and stood up to leave. Silas asked him what he was going to do now. George said he was going to go home, spend time with his daughter, and figure out what a normal life looked like. He had spent too many years in crisis mode, always preparing for the next disaster, always ready to fight. Now, he wanted to try something different. He wanted peace. As George walked out of the coffee shop, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of deception was gone. The burden of pretending to be someone he wasn't had been lifted. He had completed his mission. He had infiltrated a corrupt organization, gathered evidence, and brought down a criminal operation. And he had done it all while protecting his daughter and honoring the memory of his wife. George got his car and drove home. When he arrived, he called his daughter's school and asked if he could pick her up early. The secretary said yes. George drove to the school and waited outside. When Emily came out, she looked surprised but happy to see him. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked. "Everything's fine," George said. "I just thought we could spend the afternoon together. Maybe go to the park or get ice cream." Emily smiled. Both, George agreed. They drove to the park and spent the afternoon together, father and daughter, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. George pushed Emily on the swings. They fed ducks at the pond. They got ice cream from a truck that played cheerful music. And for a few hours, George forgot about Joe and Daniel and Thornton Security and everything else. He just focused on being a father. Later that evening, after Emily was asleep, George received a phone call from an FBI agent. The agent said they wanted George to come in for a formal interview the next day. They had questions about the evidence he had collected and about his time working at Thornton Security. George said he would be there. Over the next several weeks, George spent a lot of time with FBI investigators. He told them everything he knew about Joanne's operation. He explained how Thornton Security had orchestrated crises in multiple countries. He provided details about the shell companies and the offshore accounts. He gave them names of Joanne's associates and descriptions of her methods. The investigators were impressed with the quality of the evidence George had gathered. They told him that the case against Joanne was airtight. She would be facing multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and involvement in illegal arms deals. If convicted on all counts, she would spend the rest of her life in prison. The whistleblower reward was processed quickly. George received a check for $8 million. It was more money than he had ever imagined having. He put most of it in a trust fund for Emily's education and future. He used some of it to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools. And he donated a significant portion to organizations that help veterans transition back to civilian life. 6 months after Joanne's arrest, her trial began. George and Silas both testified. They spent hours on the witness stand, answering questions from prosecutors and defense attorneys. Joanne's lawyers tried to discredit them, suggesting they had fabricated evidence or misunderstood Thornton's business model. But the evidence was too strong. The financial records were real. The emails were authentic. The testimony from other witnesses corroborated everything George and Silas had said. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they found Joe and Daniel guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 40 years in federal prison. As the sentence was read, Joanne showed no emotion. She simply stood there, accepting her fate with the same calculated expression she had worn when offering George a job all those months ago. After the trial ended, George and Silas met one final time at the coffee shop. They talked about everything they had been through. They talked about Afghanistan and the warehouse where George had saved Silas's life. They talked about the grocery store robbery and how they had used it to bring down a criminal empire. They talked about the future and what came next. Silas said he was moving to California to start a new job with a legitimate security consulting firm. George said he was going to take some time off and focus on being a father. They promised to stay in touch. They shook hands and said goodbye. George drove home and found Emily doing homework at the kitchen table. She looked up when he came in and asked him if the trial was over. George said it was. Emily asked if the bad person was going to jail. George said yes. Emily nodded and went back to her homework, satisfied that justice had been done. That night, George stood on his back porch and looked up at the stars. He thought about all the paths his life had taken. The military, the interrogations, the missions in dangerous countries, the loss of his wife, the years of struggle trying to support his daughter on security guard wages, the fake robbery, the infiltration of Thornton Security, the takedown of Joe and Daniel. Every experience had taught him something. Every challenge had made him stronger. And now, finally, he had reached a place of peace. He had secured his daughter's future. He had brought a criminal to justice. He had honored the trust that Silas had placed in him. and he had proven to himself that it was still possible to do the right thing, even in a world that often rewarded doing wrong. George went back inside and locked the door behind him. He checked on Emily one last time, then went to his own room. He lay down on his bed and closed his eyes. For the first time in as long as he could remember, George fell asleep without worrying about what tomorrow would bring. He had done what needed to be done. The rest would take care of itself. And somewhere in a prison cell, Joanne Daniel was learning what it meant to lose everything. The empire she had built was gone. The connections she had cultivated were worthless. The money she had accumulated was frozen. All because she had made one critical mistake. She had tried to recruit a man who couldn't be bought, manipulated, or controlled. A man who had spent his entire life fighting for something bigger than himself. A man named George Michael. This story teaches us several important lessons about crisis management and personal integrity. First, staying calm under pressure allows you to think clearly and make better decisions than those who panic. George's military training taught him that emotional control is more powerful than any weapon. Second, corruption always leaves a trail, and patient documentation is more effective than hasty accusations when exposing wrongdoing. Third, true strength comes from protecting others rather than profiting from their suffering. George could have accepted Joanne's money and ignored her crimes, but he chose to do what was right for his daughter's future and for all the innocent people Joanne had harmed. Fourth, trust and loyalty matter. George's relationship with Silas, built years earlier through saving his life, became the foundation for taking down an entire criminal operation. Finally, the story reminds us that justice may be slow, but it is possible when good people refuse to compromise their values, gather solid evidence, and work together toward a common goal. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to fight with weapons, but to fight with truth, patience, and unwavering moral conviction. So here's the question. Are you subscribed yet? Thousands will hear this story and disappear without subscribing. Don't let that be you. If you're listening right now, help me prove a doubt wrong. My dad once said I'd never reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to live on. Subscribe to this channel and help keep these stories breathing. Now tell me, do you want part 2?